lesson 6.4 is on the Jews of Kefalonia, which doesn't exist and wasn't a Jewish community anymore in the Holocaust. It basically dissipated in the 1890s. Okay, it had existed, it was a place of Jewish settlement since the 12th and 13th centuries. In the 17th century, the governor wanted to attract affluent Jews so that they would deal in bookbinding. In the 18th century, the Jews still lived in the castle, in the fortress, in the castro, and afterward they established themselves in the new city. According to the local historian Angelo de Bonos, he claimed that the Jews' origin was from Malta, but if we're more precise, according to the names, they come from Corfu, Zakynthos, and some of them are from Sephardic origin. Most of the Jews lived in the capital, Argostoli, and in Levanto. In the heart of the neighborhood, in the Jewish quarter, there was a synagogue, and the community had a cemetery of its own, which existed since 1830, but the actual cemetery disappeared maybe 1870, but that's not precise either. The Jews of the island were a small population and always had a lower economic, social status. There were petty bourgeois Jews, but most were peddlers and small artisans, tinsmiths. They made light bulbs or lanterns and lamps. There were tailors and bookbinders, and of course the weavers. Some of them had store owners and some were money lenders. There were tensions, but because the Jews had a lower economic status, that also gave them some advantages, and there was relatively less enmity. In 1821, during the Greek Revolution, in Constantinople, the Sultan, or the Grand Vizier, like the Prime Minister, ordered the hanging of the Greek Archbishop, Yorgos. And so what happened was the Greek Orthodox revolted and were highly angry toward the Jews, and of course the Ottomans, all throughout the Ottoman Empire. Because traditionally, when there was a hanging like this, the Jews, as devoted citizens, were ordered by the Ottoman authorities to throw the body in the sea. So the Jews had to throw the body of the Archbishop, the most holy religious Greek Orthodox figure, into the straits of the Bosphorus, and that's when, at the beginning of the Greek Revolution, there were riots against the Jews. I've talked about this before. So all throughout the Greek Orthodox world, even in Eastern Europe, there were tensions between the locals and the Jews over issues like this, also in Romania. There were 160 names of Jewish immigrants at Kefalonia between 1819 and 1863. So, for example, there were two groups of immigrants, Jewish refugees, or settlers, from Zakynthos in 1826. And we know which boats they came and how many of them were in their names. They're typical names of Jews of the islands like Mordo, Del Medigo, Gani, etc., etc. In 1852, the British gave the Christians of the island political rights and reforms in Parliament, but they didn't give the same rights to the Jews, and they didn't improve the Jewish socio-economic or legal stature. So the Jews, because they felt underprivileged or abandoned or discriminated, they joined the more radical political movements, and this, of course, created more tension. The Jews, of course, wanted equality and tolerance, and that brought tensions with them and the nationalistic Greek Orthodox and Catholic populations. Now, in 1864, in general, the Jews welcomed Greek rule. They saw it as progressive. They saw it that they wouldn't have to suffer like under the British. They wouldn't have to be highly taxed. They wouldn't have to do road work. In 1867, we see that Yitzchak Ventura, or Maimon ben Yitzchak Ventura, he was the teacher of the Talmud Torah, and there was an emissary who came from Eretz Israel, and Ventura donated money for the poor in Hebron in Jerusalem. Now, in 1859, next to the Jewish cemetery, there was a prison, and the head of the prison, he opened up the valves for the sewage of the prison, and it overflowed and flooded the Jewish cemetery. And this caused, I think, irreparable damage, which led to the cemeteries not being used. Then there were bans on Jewish use of the cemetery, but Jews would do it anyway. And in the end, because the Jews had nowhere to bury their dead, I think this might have been one of the reasons why in the 1870s, 1880s, they just packed up and left the island. Okay? But the Jews felt that the Greek authorities were apathetic to their needs for burial. There were Jews already at the beginning of the 20th century. There was a Chacham, a Rabbi Samulakis, who had a beard and he sold light bulbs. And then there were Jews, of course, who lived there at the beginning of the 20th century, but very small numbers. So let's say, for example, in 1823 there were 139 Jews, by 1879 15 Jews, 1907 18 Jews, or in 1928 only 3 Jews, and in 1940 only 1 Jew. So the Jews basically left for the other parts of the Ionian Islands, or they went to Athens. Notable also was a Jew named Zachariah Vital, who became the Jewish president of the Jewish community of Athens. Him and his siblings were born in Kefalonia, and he was a boyhood friend of Ioannis Metaxas, who was the dictator of Greece. And during the Holocaust period, that influenced Metaxas. He harbored Jews in his mansion in Kifisia outside of Athens. He had about 20, who were part of, let's say, they were like his professional staff. He had tailors, he had painters, gardeners who were German and Central Jewish refugees. And because of his contacts with Zachariah Vital, he furthered Zionism, he furthered illegal immigration, the Keren Kayemet. He was inscribed in the Gold Book. So although Metaxas was a dictator and didn't allow Jews actually to be in the fascist Aeon youth movement, he was friendly to Jews. So you have this dichotomy. He wasn't good for Jewish culture in Greece. He was a dictator, but he had close relations. So there's, and also because he had a common Kefalonian background. In 1953, there was an earthquake in Kefalonia, also in Zakynthos, in that part of the Ionian Islands, and the Greek Navy came and helped. The famous author, Albert Cohen, he thought of his family comes from Corfu, but his first 5 years of life where he grew up in Kefalonia from 1895 to 1900. So in his book Mange Clou is about a mythical, like Hasidic figure from this island who has all sorts of adventures, and it's based on the mythology of his growing up in Kefalonia, and it was also made into a film in Paris, in France. So the Jews do have roots in this island, although life didn't continue there. For a small amount of people, it is part of their past and heritage.